China's a market. It's got great food, great culture, wonderful people, a civilization 10 times older than ours. It's not a threat.
And it is trying to dominate Asia. It wants to be like we are in the Western Hemisphere. If I was the national security advisor in Beijing, that's what I'd be telling Xi Jinping we should be trying to do. But of course, from an American point of view, this is unacceptable. And we do not tolerate peer competitors.
I deeply believe we're close to nuclear war. We have a mindset that everything is a challenge for survival and that escalation is therefore always the right approach. My view is a little bit of prudence could save the whole planet.
Hi, and welcome back to the channel. This will be another longer form podcast video on a recent debate between Dr. John Mearsheimer and Dr. Jeffrey Sachs on the question of how the US should deal with China's rise. The framing of this debate is one of a hard-nosed realist, Dr. John Mearsheimer, squaring off against a wide-eyed idealist, Dr. Jeffrey Sachs, on how to deal with a very angry and very dangerous panda bear. In reality, it's a debate between someone who thinks he understands China versus someone who actually understands China. The TLDR here is that Mearsheimer wants the US to do everything possible to contain China as its first and only priority, while Sachs advocates for the deeply un-American idea of peaceful coexistence with China. I know, the man is a communist tree-hugging hippie. I mean, peace? Coexistence? That's as un-American as the metric system and school safety. Anyway, jokes aside, let's get started. Oh, and yes, the video is being played at 1.5x speed because I know you're all TikTok-brained.
I just wanted to add a footnote, which is that China's also not a threat. It's just not a threat. I mean,
we're going to get to it.
China's a market. It's got great food, great culture, wonderful people, a civilization 10 times older than ours. It's not a threat.
Sachs is obviously correct. China is not a threat, and this should be the least controversial statement ever. When you go for a job interview, what's the first thing they look at to evaluate you? It's your past performance, obviously, your track record. Your past performance is the most reliable predictor of future performance. China has the longest and least threatening track record of any major power in the world today. In its 4,000 years of recorded history, Han Chinese civilization has fought fewer wars of aggression than the US has since George Bush Jr. became president. Not once have Han Chinese ever invaded a foreign country overseas. And no, it's not because the Chinese couldn't do it, because in the 90 years of the Mongols controlled China, they conducted 3 major overseas invasions, marking the only times in history when Japan was invaded by China, and not the other way around, despite China being the far larger power. And after the Mongols were overthrown, the Ming Dynasty constructed the largest fleet the world had ever seen to that point, larger than anything before the 19th century. They sailed that fleet all the way to Africa and somehow managed to not invade a single country along the way. Can you imagine any European power doing the same? The British can barely get in a boat without colonizing some poor Aboriginal tribe on the other side of the globe. I mean, that's literally how we got Australia and New Zealand. So claiming that China is a threat to the US, a country that is as far removed from China as you can possibly be without leaving the planet, is just not a serious argument, as a certain well-known political realist would say. Anyway, in this next part, Sachs explains the real reason why the US has a beef with China.
So why has it become so universal to assume that we are already in a state of conflict with China on not just party lines, but like almost any spectrum you could kind of like consider?
Because John said it exactly right, and he predicted it better than anyone in the whole world in 2001. He said, when China becomes large, we're going to have conflict, because that's John's theory. And it's right as a description of American foreign policy, that we are for power, they are big, therefore they're an enemy. They're an enemy of our aspiration to global hegemony.
Yep, that's the core of it. America's problem with China is not because China is communist, but because China is powerful. And the Americans don't share power. Even if China were a liberal democracy like Japan, the US will still be just as anti-Chinese as it is now. The fact that China happens to be a non democratic socialist country is just a convenient excuse for the US to attack China on. If it didn't have that excuse, then it would just have to find another excuse, like it did with Japan in the 1980s, in order to justify the Plaza Accords. Moving on, in this next part, the moderator makes an interesting point about how Mearsheimer sees the world as a political realist versus how Sachs sees it as an economist.
You and Jeff, I think, arrive at similar conclusions about Ukraine, but different ones on China, right? Because Jeff is an economist and I think sees the world in fundamentally positive some ways based on the potential for trade, economics, basically. Whereas you see the world as more of a zero-sum game based on the balance of power.
Both men are right. Yes, it's true that international trade is a win-win and that the global total wealth will always increase. But power is a zero-sum game. Just because the pie is getting bigger doesn't mean that people will stop fighting over it, especially if those people come from a country where PvP is allowed in school zones. Anyway, going back to Mearsheimer in this next segment, he talks about why he thinks China wants to be the new Asian hegemon.
The United States is a regional hegemon. It's the only regional hegemon on the planet. We dominate the Western Hemisphere. And what China has begun to do as it's got increasingly powerful economically is translate that economic might into military might, and it is trying to dominate Asia. It wants to push us out beyond the first island chain. It wants to push us out beyond the second island chain. It wants to be like we are in the Western Hemisphere. And I don't blame the Chinese one bit. If I was the national security advisor in Beijing, that's what I'd be telling Xi Jinping we should be trying to do.
Herein lies Mearsheimer's biggest blind spot on China. Like I said at the beginning of this video, responding to Jeffrey Sachs, China has proven over the course of 3 millennia that it has no interest in regional hegemony, especially not across any span of ocean. I mean, thinking that China desires hegemony is like thinking Israel desires peace. It's the most ridiculous assumption that anyone can make about Chinese intentions. The indisputable fact here is that it's the United States, not China, that is provoking this hegemonic struggle. Chinese leaders were quite happy to let the Americans play world police so long as China could get rich in the background. It was the Americans, starting with Obama and escalating with Trump and Biden, that decided to pick a fight with their biggest trading partner. And they picked this fight because they, like Mearsheimer, can't imagine that a rising power like China would not want to challenge American hegemony. The Chinese mindset of let's do business and not politics is simply inconceivable to American leaders. American big companies are only able to make huge profits overseas thanks to the big stick of the American empire. The link between business and warfare is axiomatic in the minds of American leaders. So it is impossible for them to accept that China would be any different. This is why it's so easy to sell the idea that Huawei 5G technology as Chinese spyware. If Huawei were an American company, that's exactly what they would do. And in fact, they have done. It's called PRISM. So at the end of the day, the idea of China as a threat to the US is purely a matter of self-projection. China is a threat to the US because that's what the Americans would do if they were in China's shoes. And in this next part, Mearsheimer details what the US is doing to curtail China's supposed ambitions of hegemony.
We want to remain the only regional hegemon in the world. We are a ruthless great power. We never want to lose sight of that fact. And the end result of this is you get an intense security competition between China and the United States. And it revolves around the concept of security, not prosperity.
I think this
what
is,
you just very quickly. So what you see beginning to happen is that it's in all domains where the competition takes place, especially high tech. We do not want them defeating us in the high tech war. We are competing with them economically. We are competing with them militarily. And this is because the best way to survive is for us, the United States of America, to be the only regional hegemon on the planet.
Now, there are many mysteries in this universe, like why does Japan think that blurring out genitals somehow makes it not porn? Or why Hollywood keeps trying to gaslight us into believing that Zendaya is somehow attractive. But the greatest mystery of our time is why the Americans think that they can win a war of economics and technology against the Chinese. I mean, the Americans love to mock the Chinese as being autistic math geeks who split their time between studying for the SATs and working at the Nike factory. So, why the hell would it be a good idea to start an economic and technological rivalry with 1.4 billion of them? Trying to win a war of economics and technology against China is as foolish as trying to win a war of attrition against Russia. And so, of course, the US is doing both at the same time, while also fighting another war in the Middle East, because why not? Anyway, let's claw back some sanity and listen to Sachs' opinion on how the US should deal with China.
I read a very good book, John's, and John described, I'm going to quote him, but he can quote himself afterwards. He said that the regional hegemons don't threaten each other, actually. Why? Because we have big ocean in between. I deeply believe that China is not a threat to the United States. And I deeply believe the only threat to the United States, period, in the world, given the oceans, given our size, and given the military, is nuclear war. I deeply believe we're close to nuclear war because we have a mindset that leads us in that direction. We have a mindset that everything is a challenge for survival and that escalation is therefore always the right approach. My view is a little bit of prudence could save the whole planet.
It's rare for me to hear something that I agree with 100%, but this is it. The only real threat to the US, the only real existential threat, is America's own strategic arrogance. Even if China wins a war over Taiwan, it doesn't mean that the PLA robo-dogs will be storming down the streets of San Francisco or even Hawaii. The Pacific is simply too big, and more importantly, China simply doesn't have that kind of mentality. The only way that Americans on American soil will die in a war with China is if the Americans push the nuclear button first. But, alas, there's no fixing this mentality. Americans are the descendants of Anglo-Saxons, Normans, Germans, and Spanish. None of these cultures are known for being particularly peaceful. There is a reason why English and Spanish are spoken so far from their home countries, and it's not because the Native Americans use Duolingo. Strategic aggression is as deeply embedded in American culture and psyche as non-aggression is in Chinese culture and psyche. When that aggression is applied to native peoples who haven't even discovered steel or gunpowder yet, you get the largest imperial conquests the world's ever seen. Hooray for genocide, I guess. But when that kind of hyper-aggression is applied to a nuclear-armed panda, you get the ultimate victory of the cockroaches. Anyway, that's enough of me dunking on Mearsheimer and glazing Sachs for one day. I hope this video added some meaningful commentary on these well-trodden arguments. If you disagree with my points, please call me out in the comments and we'll have a nice Quora-style debate where I respond with snark and sarcasm that half the people don't seem to get. That will at least drive the algorithm. Anyway, that's the end of the video. I'll see you next time.